focus tonight on talking to the Taliban and whether talks and a political process should be the way forward. I begin with a quote. The US should not delay its significant involvement in talks with the Taliban leadership because without the US's support in this respect, there can be no long-term peace in Afghanistan. As a key ally, the UK has an important role to play in encouraging the US to adopt a more proactive approach in this respect. That was the conclusion of a recent and highly critical report from the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee on Britain's involvement in Afghanistan, and we'll come to questions in a moment with the panel. Just to sort of set the scene on talking to the Taliban, I did it 4 years ago for the BBC, and I was called a traitor on the BBC's Question Time by a then shadow minister, who is now a very senior minister in this government. But things have changed. This government, far from considering talking to the Taliban treason, now appear to believe that it's one of the ways out, that a political process alongside the military process, and by political process they mean a more widely understood political process right across Afghanistan, would be the answer. Most of the policy in recent years, it seems to me, has been around the edges, not actually going to the centre and talking to the Taliban themselves. Talks about good Taliban, bad Taliban, cutting out the core, rather than real negotiations. And at the moment there are real negotiations as far as we know. So the sorts of questions we might be asking tonight: is the US serious about a political process and a political settlement, or would they prefer an outright military victory? It certainly looks as if General David Petraeus is moving more in that direction at the moment. Is the Afghan government serious? President Karzai talks about talking to the Taliban, has set up a peace council to do it, but he doesn't feel as inclusive a sort of politician as he might be. And given that the Taliban were excluded from any of the discussions, the Big Tent discussions weren't big enough to include them in 2001. They've been excluded from the political process for a long time, and they do represent some people. What compromises would have to be made if the Taliban were brought into some kind of a political process? Where would that leave Afghan women, given their pretty wretched record when they were in government? How can Pakistan be fully engaged in the process? So all of these are questions we might be talking about, and I'm pleased to have on this panel some pretty serious people. Reid has spent more time in Afghanistan than many other Westerners in recent years, is now the Afghanistan researcher for Human Rights Watch. Next to me here, Shaykh Abdullah Anas Bashir, who works for something called the TARUF Association. And TARUF, I think, means together.
Yes.
Is that right? TARUF means together. So he is a former Mujahideen fighter, connected with Afghanistan for many years, and now somebody who has been engaged in trying to get better peace process going. My colleague from the BBC, Emil Parsley, who's the multimedia editor for the BBC Pashto Persian service on my right, and anyone who's travelled in Afghanistan knows that the BBC remains, even to this day, the prime source of information for people out in the villages. So Emil's highly experienced in reporting that country. And finally, on the far end, we're very pleased to have Karen Pierce, who's the FCO's Director for South Asia and Afghanistan, succeeded Sir Sherard Cooper-Coles in that role, and we're very pleased to have her here tonight. And I will start, actually, with Abdullah Anas, because you've been engaged at some level with talks. What kind of talks have been going on? I know Saudi Arabia has been involved as an interlocutor. What sort of talks with the Taliban are happening as far as you know at the moment?
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Microphone collapsing on the floor even as we start. Here we are. Let's start again.
Thank you.
There we are. There we are.
And also, I apologize if I could not bring the right word to explain the right meaning. English is not my first language. I think your question to be answered, it's need a conference, a whole 3 days conference to answer it.
You've got about 2 minutes.
Oh, cool. Let me just take a half minute to say I left Algeria in '84 to go to Afghanistan. because Afghanistan was occupied by Soviets, and for my Islam, for my jihad, it's to liberate Afghanistan, to help your brothers. And then in 1992, we left Afghanistan after there was no Soviets there, and unfortunately, Afghanistan went to a civil war. And then after 13 years, in 2006, December 2006, I decided to go to Afghanistan, trying to find two answers for my two questions. The war on terror or jihad against occupiers, as it happening now. And second question, how to avoid not to repeat what happened after 92. So this leads to have two solutions. Now recruitment happening in two parts. West and soldiers and NATO Americans trying to bring nation or European or Americans to support them to fight terror in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, Taliban, Qaeda, Hizb Islami, whatever, anyone trying to get more recruited people to fight against, I don't mind to say that slogans, crusaders, occupiers, infidels, anything to recruit. So
let's call them ISAF.
Yes. Yes. Now we have 10 years people getting lost in Afghanistan under these two slogans. I found it easily after 15, 20 years again, if we are talking about maybe 10,000 victims, easily we are going to talk about 100,000 lives. If this goes, the war will continue like that.
But is the leadership of that, what you now describe as a sort of global pan-Islamic appeal, are the leadership, mostly based in the northwest frontier of Pakistan, now interested in talking to the people, to ISAF nations?
I mean by leadership, Taliban is part of the solution. The problem of Afghanistan, it's more deeper than just Taliban will come or not. In 1992, I remember everyone was just how to fight Soviets, sure, to kick
sure,
them out.
Given that it's a complex problem, yeah, and deeper even than that, but do you think that they are now willing to talk?
I cannot say yes and no, because when you say the parts of the reconciliation are more than one part, okay, more than one player. Former Mujahideen, or geographically, we are talking about north and south.
Sure. But talking about
politically, we are talking about Taliban and the government, sure, and former Mujahideen.
Talking about the southern leadership, the southern Pashtun insurgent leadership.
Even Taliban, when you say Taliban, part of Taliban, Quetta Shora, part of Taliban, Waziristan, part of Taliban in Pakistan, part of Taliban inside Afghanistan, part of Taliban ready to talk, part of Taliban saying, because one direction is jihad against the West, one part saying jihad just against soldiers who are in our land in Afghanistan. Okay, if they leave Afghanistan, so no more jihad.
The part of the Taliban who are willing to talk, are talks now, as far as you're concerned, beginning to happen? Under what basis are they willing to talk? And what are they willing to talk about?
Oh, they say it in the officially. We want stop our fighting when there is no foreigner soldiers in Afghanistan. They say it. It's, officially, they say that every time. But another groups inside Afghanistan saying how to reach that point. So it's not that simple. I don't like to make it very simple.
I'm going to come back to you in a moment. I want to turn to Karen Pierce from the Foreign Office. That we heard the sort of conditions, as it were, that have been the Taliban are imposing. President Karzai has exactly opposite, 90-degree opposite conditions. He says he'll talk to anybody who lays down their weapons, who accepts the Afghan constitution, and who is willing to come into this political process. He's been very clear on that, but they're insurgents, they're not going to do that. So is there, from your point of view, a sort of completely impossible situation where there are two completely opposing conditions being set on talks, or is there, do you think, now the possibility of some kind of political reconciliation?
Well, thank you, David, and I apologise because I'm losing my voice. I think, first of all, the government recognises, a lot of our international partners recognise, that insurgencies are usually brought to an end by some sort of political process. And as you said, David, the international strategy is a combination of the military pressure and finding that political incentive, and that's our goal. But the political side has to be Afghan-led. President Karzai has set 3 conditions: renounce al-Qaeda, lay down weapons, work within the constitutional framework. But he's also made clear that those are conditions for a final agreement. They're not preconditions for talks. In terms of the Taliban, I think maybe the first point I'll make is that the insurgency is not just the Taliban. There's Haqqani, there's Hekmatyar, there are different factions within the Taliban. Even within the Taliban themselves, there are different factions. Over the past 6 months or so, what we've seen is the number of feelers from people who say they represent the Taliban has gone up. But none of these have developed.
Shopkeeper, I recall.
There are others, not shopkeepers. But none of these has developed into what you might call a load-bearing channel. And there is no evidence at the moment that the Taliban leadership outside the country are interested in talks, let alone any sort of negotiation. So one of the tasks that falls to us, and anyone who heard Mrs. Clinton's speech on the 18th of February will have heard her say this. It's about finding that way of starting the political process, splitting the Taliban from al-Qaeda, and finding a political way forward to accompany what's been happening on the military side, what's happening on the development side.
Well, I began with this quote from the Foreign Affairs Committee saying Britain needs to put pressure on the United States to actually get serious about negotiations. But do you think now that there is a genuine shift in Washington, that they are, I mean, you mentioned Hillary Clinton's speech, and she certainly speaks a very different language to what we heard a couple of years ago. But do you think there's a genuine impetus towards technical talks on the ground with the insurgents, or assisting the Afghans to do that anyway?
It's very much an Afghan-led process. I really want to stress that. It is about, this is their country, it is about President Karzai finding the means to talk to the Taliban and create a more representative political process. We will support that. The Americans will support that. And Mrs. Clinton was very clear about the need for a political process. I think the difficulty at the moment is it's not clear that the Taliban want to engage in that political process on a level that's significant. And one of the things we do, the Afghans do, is try and find if there is a significant channel to take this
sort of
forward.
mood-improving negotiations, organisations like TARUF going in and out of Saudi Arabia, individuals who are more than, you know, the shopkeeper in the northwest frontier, who do actually sort of take messages one way and another. Do you see all of that as a so-called track 2 negotiating process as being valuable? Is it something that's feeding usefully into a real process?
I wouldn't, to be honest, David, give it the status of track 2 yet. It hasn't reached that level of formality. There may be a time over the next few months where a track 2 process is valuable. It may be one of those scenarios where you actually can't do it through track 2. There's too much at stake, as Abdullah was outlining, and actually you have to find a different route. I think, as I say, the difficulty at the moment is that none of the feelers, and there are a lot of these feelers, but none of them have produced something that gives you confidence there's a real channel there.
I should just explain to people who you know, the diplomatic nuance of the language. Track 1 negotiations are negotiations between people at the table who are actually you need to bring to the table. Track 2 negotiations are people outside that who might bring those individuals to the table who, as it were, lay the environment for those to happen. So when people talk about track 2 negotiations, they're things that happen in private country houses in England where Britain flies over different parties with different peace negotiations that happen mostly behind closed doors before the main event, before the summit itself. Emma, you're shaking your head
Yes.
at most of this. Where do you stand on all this?
Because I'm the only Afghan here. I don't believe that it is everything to do with the political aspect is led by the Afghan government. No. Right from day one, on 17th of December 2001, when Karzai got the power in Kabul, even from that day, he was saying the Taliban are our brothers, we want a peaceful negotiation. In fact, the Kandahar city, before the fall of Kandahar, Taliban and Karzai were talking, and I know a Taliban high-ranking official at the time was willing to hand over Kandahar to Karzai, not to Ghulam Shirzai, who is now governor of Nangarhar province. And the reason is that they were trusting Karzai rather than the warlords. So to blame now Karzai for not leading the negotiation is not right. To be honest, right from day one, the American went on with an attitude that we will just demolish them, they are this and they are that. And
so you believe he would have brought them to the table in December, January 2001 too?
Differently, and at that time it was pretty much easy also, because Taliban were willing to just join. I could give you one example. A guy called Jihangir Wal, who was the deputy head of culture and information in Kandahar during the Taliban regime. And he, 2 years later, from Zabul, he called BBC Pashto section, and he was saying that we have a Turkish engineer, the first one that they abducted, that we are releasing him. If you want to talk to this guy, go ahead. And because I met this guy, and I told him that, why on earth you are fighting? You are not a guy of a war. And he told me that if I go to Pakistan, Pakistanis will arrest me and tell me to go and fight. If I don't fight, they will arrest me. If I go to Kandahar, the Afghan government will arrest me and hand me over to the American. So the best way is to have an AK-47 and be here, so at least I could save myself. That sort of attitude, and this is because of the American, to be honest, at that time. The Americans were willing to pay people, just get me anyone and I will pay you $10,000 because he is a Taliban.
I'm not sure I quite agree with the characterization of that. If that was the case, then why did the Afghan government not insist that the Taliban were part of the process in the summer of 2002 when there was this moment, the only moment since 1979 really, when the diaspora returned, when all of the warlords were there, when there was this grand tent lawyer jirga bringing together...
There were two things. First of all, more than 70% of that jirga was those people who were fighting Taliban for up to 6 months before that. So they were definitely against it. And secondly, Americans.
Well, so Afghans were against it.
Part of the
were there, opposed bringing the
because
Taliban
they were fighting, because they were fighting against the same Taliban. So half of the current Afghan government is still not in favor of Taliban for different reasons. But I am not supporting Karzai, but to be honest, in this point, Karzai always tried to even call Mullah Omar his brother. And all the time, he was punched by the American in a way to, no, they are this and that. And all these conditions, that constitution, this and that, all these conditions were laid by the American, not by the Afghan government.
Rachel, how do you see the sort of political and military tracks, as it were? I mean, the Americans... During the last year, American and British special forces killed a very large number of mid-ranking Taliban commanders on the ground. They really changed the sort of nature of the war. From where you sit in Kabul, do you see political reconciliation bringing the Taliban in some form as possible? And do you think it's a good thing?
I mean, I see it as being some way off still, partly because of the point that was being made earlier, that I'm not really sure that although Karzai has been in favour of working with the Taliban since 2001, as Amal says, the government that he's created is now part of the obstacle to peace, because it's full of these very disreputable former warlords with terrible war crimes, records of war crimes, horrible corruption. It's a sort of semi-mafia state that's profiting hugely from the war economy. And this is not a good partner for peace. So that I see as a major obstacle. And then on the international side, although rhetorically the US is in favour of talks, and certainly Hillary Clinton expresses that regularly, I'm not so convinced that the Pentagon are fully behind it, and it's also not clear where the CIA stands. I mean, the US is not one body in Afghanistan, it never has been. And in terms of, as you mentioned, special forces, there's been a massive intensification of their kill-capture campaign over the last year. We've seen a huge increase in night raids and detention operations, and actually they're quite buoyant. And I don't see them as really being interested in reconciliation in this mood. So I'm not really sure that the conditions are there at all for a peace process. And as to the question of whether I would want to see it, I mean, clearly coming from a human rights perspective, it's something one views with a somewhat heavy heart, because the Taliban obviously had an abysmal record when they were in government, and even today in areas that are under de facto Taliban control, you see... It's not brilliant for women in Afghanistan even today, though, in areas that are not under Taliban control. Sure. I mean, it's still the worst, still the most dangerous country in the world to have a baby. You know, I heard Malala Joya, Afghan woman MP, in this room receiving a human rights award 4 or 5 years ago, saying conditions for women in Afghanistan are worse now than they were under the Taliban. So I mean, it's not a wonderful place to be a woman even now. It's a very poor developing world country, and conditions are bad across the board for women in whatever area you're living in. But if you're living in an area that's under de facto Taliban control, you're quite likely to receive death threats if you're working in public life. We see attacks on schools, we see intimidation of women, and not just women. I mean, to be honest, the terror campaign we see in the south over the last year has been extraordinary. There's been an increase of more than 100% in assassinations, targeted assassinations of civilians. This is a movement with a very brutal record. And it's not to say that the Afghan government has an impeccable record itself. Clearly there are war criminals in the cabinet and you know, as a vice president. But we can't, there is a tendency, I think, to whitewash some of these crimes by the Taliban at the moment, particularly by those who are advocating for reconciliation, which, as I say, I'm not opposed to. I just think we need to be really honest about what it means so that we can actually safeguard some of the rights that have been protected. I'll just give you one example of the whitewashing. You may have seen earlier in the year there was a story about the Minister of Education saying that the Taliban had done a U-turn on a girl's access to education. This was Minister Wardak. His own statistics showed that attacks on schools had increased last year. I did some research on women in Taliban areas and looked at attacks on schools, and you get things like a letter to a teacher saying, if you don't close down this school for girls, we will cut off the heads of your boys and set your daughter on fire. I mean, it's a serious terror campaign. And when I suggested this, that was not the case, to Minister Wardak, and I showed him some of the night letters from these areas, he cast them aside and said, if we had the time, I could explain to you why this is the handwriting of a Pakistani and not an Afghan. This is not being done by Afghans. And he then went on to tell me why he didn't think that Mullah Omar really existed. So this is a kind of mad conspiracy you get, particularly from Afghans who want to blame everything on Pakistan. I'm sure we'll get on to Pakistan, and clearly it's a huge part of the problem, but it's not the sole cause of the insurgency.
Just on the Frontline record, alleged war criminal, the Vice President. Might be able to say he's a war criminal, but I couldn't possibly. I mean, given the situation of, you know, if the Taliban were to return in any form or to have any place in a future Afghanistan, why isn't the British government, to turn the first question round on its head, saying, look, this is absolutely outrageous to have them involved in any kind of peace process at all. Our boys and indeed women have been dying on the ground in Helmand. We should keep the Taliban out.
I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning, David. Insurgencies typically end with some form of political solution. And that typically involves a certain degree, not a universal degree, of rehabilitation. And there are plenty of examples of that from Northern Ireland, just to cite the most obvious. But I think Rachel makes some very valid points about behaviours. I suspect that in any serious negotiation, and I agree with Rachel, this is not, by any manner of means, near a serious negotiation. But when there are serious negotiations on these things, typically the sorts of questions that involve who is in, who is out, where the amnesties are drawn, tend to come right at the end of the process when people see that some sort of settlement is in sight.
Except it's already a blanket amnesty for anyone.
Well, that does put Afghanistan at odds with some of its international commitments. And one of the things NATO said at its recent summit was that we would all expect Afghanistan to stand by its international commitments. But I think, in all honesty, it's not a live question yet. When it becomes a live question, some of these difficult issues are going to have to be gone into.
It was a live question a year ago when the amnesty law was passed by the Afghan government, and the British government said nothing on this. And this is an amnesty that gives a blanket amnesty to anyone accused of war crimes. And also it's got a bizarre clause that basically says if you sign up to the reconciliation process, whereby you say, I renounce violence and I like the Constitution, that's it, then you get an amnesty for any future crimes as well. So you could bomb a supermarket next week, and the following week go to the government and say, sorry, I've changed my mind, I renounce violence now. The international community was silent on the amnesty law when it came to pass last year, and I think this is really serious, because actually one of the reasons why I think both the counterinsurgency strategy is failing and why I think the peace process, should one come to pass, is failing, is the absence of any real political will on these questions about justice and impunity. And the international community has sadly been a major part of that.
Abdullah, if I could just ask you as a representative of the Mujahideen generation, is there hope among people who fought in the 1980s that at some point this long horror could finish?
Yes, but with a little bit of difficulties. It's not simple. It's not easy. And I do believe the unity and the peace and the reconciliation will come from the society itself, not from the NATO, not from ISAF. The ISAF, NATO...
But I think that's what we're hearing from the British government. It has to be an Afghan process.
Yeah, so that's why there is no any plan, any projects now inside Afghanistan, how to do it inside Afghanistan. Society completely frozen. There is no projects, no plans, nothing is happening inside Afghanistan between scholars, media, everyone. Just I met the head of the Peace Council, Ustad Burhanuddin Rabbani, just a week ago in Istanbul. So my question was, through my visits to Afghanistan during the last 3-4 years, just the society just sitting in their homes, scholars, leaders, media people, journalists, waiting how many people died, how many people killed, where the explosion happened. So where are you? This is your country. It's 30 million people, and you fought against Soviets. So take the initiative in your hand and do it. So we have one level called War on Terror and Jihad against NATO, and we have another which is another society, another plan, another project inside Afghanistan, how to discuss, open Jalalabadi with Kandahari, with Mazar Sharif, through university, through the media, through journalists, through the mullah, bringing the fatwa. So nothing. Afghanistan, it's stopped, it's doing nothing. That's why we are trying. Not official. I cannot. I'm not a decision maker. But if I could,
you're trying to build the conditions where peace talks might take
we
place.
are. I don't like to exaggerate or to say just words in the air. We never reached even the level of negotiation. We are too far. We are just trying to bring the conditions. And that conditions, we experience two levels. If you leave the Afghans themselves together, it's very easy. When you bring the elements, the agendas, the interests of neighbors here and there get complicated. A journey of one day will be 1 year inside Afghanistan. So that's why...
Would you, and this sort of characterization of a society that's really just stuck, that's not doing anything?
I will not 100% agree with this. There were jirgas or gatherings of youth, Afghan youth in the past. There were jirgas of different people. But the main thing is back to, I will blame the West here. The reason is that who could guarantee that any Taliban could come and stay in Kandahar or in Kabul without being arrested? Karzai cannot guarantee that. I mean, I know numerous Taliban said that, okay, can you guarantee me that I could come over there? No. The only guy who was guaranteed by the ISAF, and they were jumping up and down that we brought somebody to Kabul, he was that shopkeeper who got money and gone. Nobody in the Afghan government could guarantee that they could be not touched by the ISAF.
As a representative of government, your response to that would be, well, we're not omnipotent. We can't protect everybody, and
they don't need to protect.
This is Afghanistan.
They should not arrest that person. They don't need to protect them. Afghan government will protect them, as long as they don't arrest them and send them to Guantanamo. That's the thing. Or background.
I think life has moved on a little bit from some of the things Imal's referring to. There are ex-Taliban who live openly and in relative security and safety in Kabul. So that route is open already. It's clear, I think, that route's obviously not being the route
only two people. One was released from Guantanamo, Mullah Zaif, who was ambassador in Pakistan, and the other one is Mutawakkil, who was foreign minister of the Taliban. And both of them cannot leave Kabul city, 10 miles away from Kabul city. They are home arrest, but not arrested. But
they can now. I mean, they were taken off the UN watch list a year ago, rather significantly, which was seen by many people as being a signal that maybe these could be the interlocutors with the Taliban leadership. That if Mullah Zaif could travel a bit, and then he could.
Yeah, he was in London recently. Yeah, but that's only recently that them two are allowed. Not two, only Zaif. He is allowed to go to London. But Mutawakkil wanted to go to Hajj. He was not allowed a few years ago. I don't know, last year or the year before. So they are based only in Kabul, and they have no voice.
I think, if I just may, I don't know that it's certain that the leadership outside Afghanistan would see those two people as its interlocutors. So there's another level of difficulty.
But actually, interestingly, in Kabul a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a government official about the prospects for using the media, the Afghan media, to have kind of negotiations and discussions about reconciliation and bring together some of these groups, including the Taliban and some of the anxious communities in society, like women or religious minorities, and suggested that it might be people like Mullah Zaif. And he said, no, that's too much, basically. We couldn't have government ministers sharing a platform with somebody like Mullah Zaif. That was too radical, even an idea, which actually gives you an indication of quite how hesitant and divided they are within government.
But are you now willing to talk to the core leadership? And is that what you're trying to get to?
It's an Afghan-led process. Well, it's for President Karzai to say who he'll talk to, and he's said he'll talk to anyone.
But the UK and the US would now be willing to be part of a process that engaged Mullah Omar.
I'm not going to put names on this. It's not for me to say who's in, who's out. If President Karzai asks for our help with specific initiatives, we'll look at that in the light of circumstances. We'll look at it on its merits.
Well, when there was an individual who was emerged a year or so ago in Quetta as being somebody who might want to talk to the West, he was immediately arrested by Pakistan. I mean, how do you see, perhaps a slightly difficult, sensitive question in public, but how do you see the Pakistani government's role? I mean, there are many different bits of Pakistan, as there are the United States, security, political, and different bits of the security apparatus who have different relationships with the Taliban. But do you see Pakistan as being a useful supporter in a peace process with the Taliban?
First of all, I just want to say that the United States is not organised like Pakistan. And I just think we might get that on the record in case anyone misconstrues the nature of your question.
Well, all I was saying was
I think Rachel's point. Yes, I think Rachel's points are very.
There are 5 people in Kabul, 5 US citizens in Kabul, all with the title of ambassador, for different bits of the US process. I mean, you know,
I shouldn't worry about that. Americans retain their title. If we did in our system, I'd be an ambassador, but we don't. We have a different system, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think where Rachel was spot on is that there are large parts of the Afghan government who do think this is all about Pakistan. It's not about Afghans harming Afghans, and I'm afraid the facts don't bear that out. However, Pakistan is a very important part of this process for the reasons you mentioned. It's not that one would want to give Pakistan control of the process. She doesn't have a veto on it, but she clearly is an important player, and she clearly also has a very important stake because extremism in Afghanistan fuels extremism in Pakistan and vice versa. And as long as there is ungoverned space either side of the border, in a way the extremism is going to feed off itself wherever it occurs, and that's dangerous for both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the more we can urge them to cooperate together transparently and closely, the easier this issue will eventually be to solve. That's not to say there aren't other neighbours of Afghanistan also with strong interests. There are, and I don't want to get into the whole India-Pakistan thing or Iran, but I think it's safe to say we've always known all those neighbours have a very close interest in what happens in Afghanistan. And the trick of diplomacy, if you like, is to find a way of turning that interest into something constructive that supports a stable and secure Afghanistan.
In Pakistan, I mean, do you always know who you're talking to? Because the ISI say they no longer support the Pakistani Taliban, but clearly do.
I think I would have confidence in Pakistani official statements, whether from the civilian government or from military figures, that for them the goal of a stable and secure Afghanistan is a goal in and of itself. They recognise the value of that for Pakistan and for the region. I think you will find no one in the region who would support the Taliban coming back into power. And I think that's true across the region. But there is interest in seeing whether or not the Taliban could reshape themselves into some sort of political party or parties that can then take part in a more representative system within Afghanistan.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. As always at the Frontline, I recognise people who have a lot of experience in the country that one's talking about. There's a microphone. Any thoughts struck into silence in the front? You could just give us your name, and if you have an affiliation that's useful, perhaps tell us.
Yeah, I've got a name, Ollie Campbell. No affiliation, just an interested member of the public. I'd like to ask Karen if I could, please. I accept that insurgencies end with political solutions. However, with both the Prime Minister and President Obama advocating fairly strict timelines for the withdrawal of ISAF troops, what pressure is there for the Taliban to come to the negotiating table at all? Is it not just in their interest to sit out the Western, I use the term loosely, occupation, and then deal with the remnants of the Afghan government?
I think there are 3 parts to that answer, if I may. Part 1 is that the ANSF all the time is getting more capable of providing security in Afghanistan. So they themselves, in 5 years' time, will be the chief deterrent to insurgent action, if you like. And I think that's quite an important deterrent. I think the second part relates to the expectation created a year or 2 ago that American forces would be leaving in July this year. They won't. A small drawdown will probably take place. So come August 2011, a large number of international forces will still be there. And I think that will come as a shock to some of the insurgents who have relied on the rhetoric of the West going. And then I think the third reason is that other things are happening in Afghanistan on the politics, on the economic development, and therefore there is an incentive, if you like, for people who genuinely want to come back to Afghanistan to be part of that picture rather than oppose it. But it's not something one takes for granted. It's something we've got to constantly work at with the Afghans and others.
Rachel, how do you see the timeline working, this deadline?
I think the US has been obsessed with this timeline. You go to DC and it's all anyone talks about, just as here for a while all anyone talked about was how many helicopters Britain had in Afghanistan, rather than actually what the strategy was. I agree. I don't think the US is about to pull out. In fact, I think there's a massive rearmament campaign going on. Not only the build-up of the army and the police, you've got this new force that's being built up called the Afghan local police, which is the latest experiment essentially in tribal militias. Very under-trained local guys being thrown into the field as protection. It was described to me by a minister in the Ministry of Interior as shields of meat. And you've got the NDS, the Afghan Intelligence Service, reactivating old Mujahideen networks in the north. You've got a lot of Afghans who are really anxious about this level of rearmament. And actually this comes back to the point that Abdullah made that I thought was very interesting about the kind of frozen nature of society and how difficult that makes genuine kind of dispute resolution at the local level or at the wider level. And you hear about these phrases about winning hearts and minds and persuading communities to support the government, but actually as though it's some kind of a soft war. It's actually a very hard war if you're living in those communities, because they're essentially forcing you to choose sides as if this was some kind of a binary situation with the good side and the bad side. And actually it doesn't look like that to a lot of Afghans. If you're in Kandahar and the local commander that ISAF is working with, I was in Kandahar in October and was talking to people who were terrified of this local commander called Abdullah, who is being described as a folk hero by the US military and is actually responsible for extrajudicial executions. He's a big drug runner. He's notorious in the area. And is not somehow the good guy that you want to choose to side with, finally. So I think this is part of the reason why there is kind of stasis there's not much movement in these communities, because there's such pressure to go to one side or another. And if there is a pullout, that's what really worries me in terms of civilian protection, because we're pushing people more and more to take sides. And then what happens to them when special forces leave? And they've been seen to choose the wrong side by the Taliban. I think it will be really bloody. And I also think it's very dangerous that you've got this massive rearmament with hundreds of thousands of armed men and increasing ethnic division, increasing anxiety and tension within government and across the country, and a lot of Afghans worried about civil war.
Yeah, if I could add to this, back in 1992, when 89 when the Soviet troops left Afghanistan, everybody was thinking that within a week Dr. Najib's government will collapse because they cannot survive on their own. They had more than 200,000 army, very strong one, but they survived for 3 years, and the reason was they had a motive. They were following a communist or whatever ideology that they were following, all of them. Only they collapsed when within their ranks some people joined Mujahideen, and as a result their government collapsed. The current police and army force got this problem. They don't have a motive. They are fighting for $300. If they are going to the front line, they will be paid $300. If they don't go to the front line, they will be paid $100. And Taliban can pay them $400. So why on earth they will fight?
In 1989-90, there was a women's brigade in Kabul,
yeah.
who were recruited by Najibullah because people didn't want the women certainly didn't want the Mujahideen to return. The Mujahideen, of course, were financed by the United States and Saudi Arabia and indeed Britain, and most of the money went to the most extremist Pashtun Mujahideen leaders. So in terms of consistency of policy over the last 30 years and whether we're actually on the side of Afghan women, that is a question. There's one here actually first, and then you.
James Thacker. I've worked with 9 human rights movements, including Ken. And I'm commenting on Afghanistan since 9 days after September 11th, when I went on the BBC and said, don't do it, basically. I'm trying to characterize what the Shaykh and the BBC are saying here, and can I just quote 2 people? One of them, David Kilcullen 4 years ago, who was at that time Petraeus' advisor, who's an Australian, said that there were 12 Taliban civil courts operating in Afghanistan, that they were building civic government from the bottom up, and it was the only legitimate power there. And the other person I'd like to quote is Godfrey Glubb, who fought with the militias and became Arabized. He was Glubb Pasha's son, went to all the Pan-Arab meetings. When I asked him in '96 what the hope of Islam was, from Indonesia and Morocco, he said, not the FLN, not the Ba'ath, maybe once upon a time the PA, the Taliban. Now, is it possible that the Taliban, there is still in Afghanistan a belief that the unique and only legitimate power, at that time the best there could be, for all we may disapprove of the Taliban, that may be the legitimate power, and that's the only power in Afghanistan that's seen the legitimate power?
This question to me.
Well, if you like. Sorry, hold on.
If we see what happened in '92 and '96 and after Bond Treaty 2001, always the problem of leadership, legitimacy inside Afghanistan always remained unsolved. The consequences always civil war. And I do believe to answer the question of leadership, to solve the problem of leadership inside Afghanistan, it's just to be through the Afghans. But the problem is how to do it. You need stability, how to do with neighbors.
Given that, I mean, behind that question, given that Mullah Omar is the Amir al-Mu'mineen and the sort of leader of the Jihad, is he in Afghan villages, do you believe, seen still as the sort of the only true leader that the country's got? Or is that sort of romantic rubbish?
If we could say Afghanistan is open for everyone, and come and let Afghan people giving bay'ah or loyalty to you as Amir al-Mu'mineen through the election, welcome, no problem.
But they don't see that at the moment.
No.
They don't see the Taliban.
At least a part of the country will never see it. The north, for example, and Tajik.
No, even in the south, this is not the case.
Maybe, yeah.
If I could add here, for the first time in over 30 years, the current Kabul government, whether it is weak or whatever it is, but the government is called government. I will give you this example. During the communist regime in late 1970s, their soldiers were called Khalqis or Parchamis, which was their political parties. After that, when the Mujahideen took over, their forces were called Mujahideen. During the Taliban, their forces were called Taliban. But only during this government, their troops are called ANA, or the Afghan National Army, or the ANP, Afghan National Police. So that means that for any Afghan, the current government got some sort of legitimacy. Whether it is right or wrong, that's a different thing.
There's one here right at the front. You, yes.
I still have not...
Sorry, can you give us your name?
My name is Jessie Harrington, another member of the public. I still haven't understood who the Taliban is, who it is, and what does the international community want from Afghanistan apart from security?
When I was talking to a police chief in Maiwand about 3 weeks ago, he said the insurgency is so messy now that it's not just Mullah Omar's Taliban and the drug leaders, but it's people who are inspired to take up the gun because there's so much American aid money sloshing around that they all want to have a slice of it. There's a kind of aid war, as it were. But Abdullah, who are the Taliban? You gave us this jigsaw puzzle at the beginning. We're back into your jigsaw puzzle. I mean, who are the people who, and behind, and I'll ask Karan the other half of your question, which is, is the international community on the right.
Officially, Taliban under leadership of somebody called Mullah Omar. He's the Amir al-Mu'mineen, officially so far. He's leading a group called Quetta Shura. They believe not in international jihad, they believe in inside Afghanistan jihad against foreigner soldiers. If there is no foreigner soldiers in Afghanistan, so jihad over. They believe in this way. I don't know, maybe sometime another groups maybe Waziristan, maybe Haqqani, his group. No, they share the same part of the philosophy of jihad of Al-Qaeda. Jihad against non-Muslims everywhere. If you blew up yourself in Algeria or Paris or Kandahar, you are mujahid everywhere. So I think maybe what will happen in the future with this block of Mullah Omar and Quetta Shura, they will succeed, and peace reconciliation, these initiatives will go fast and succeed or will fail. So that's why I'm just always try to repeat, we are just trying to bring the elements of reconciliation on the table.
Well, peace will be with Afghan nationalists, not with Al-Qaeda. But the other half of that question was that, this sense that actually the reason for the war was to prevent Afghanistan being a haven for Al-Qaeda, and that was achieved by November 2001. Why are British troops still there?
Well, the Al-Qaeda threat has not entirely gone. And the lesson of Al-Qaeda is that it moves into ungoverned space. So if you have ungoverned space in Afghanistan, which you would if Western troops withdrew, then there is an enormous risk Al-Qaeda will come back. And if you look at Pakistan, as we were saying, there's a lot of violent extremism there, and it crosses the border. So there's still a very good, valid security reason for international forces to be in Afghanistan. But the other thing I would say is that they are there at the invitation of the Afghan government and with a Chapter 7 UN Security Council resolution. So in that sense, if you like, they represent legitimacy, they represent the desire of the international community to help Afghanistan. Beyond our own desire to protect our own people from Al-Qaeda and violent extremism, there's no selfish UK, American or other interest in Afghanistan. We genuinely want to help make the country stable and secure and able to look after its own security. And even after the deadline that the Prime Minister has set, we expect to be in Afghanistan training, mentoring with a strong civilian capability, but trying to get the Afghans to take the lead so that international and Western measures can step back, if you like.
But again, the most critical part of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report was the lack of an overarching narrative, the lack of a reason articulated to the British public as to why the war goes on.
Well, I think it's interesting that people feel that. I think ministers have set out that we are there for reasons of security, our own security, Afghanistan's security, the security of our friends and partners, and it's fundamentally about protecting ourselves and them from violent extremism and terrorism. I do find it interesting, if I can just add a personal note, that in many ways people find it easier to rally to the protection of civilians than to security reasons and rationale, and I think that's understandable. One of the reasons ISAF has changed its approach in the last couple of years is precisely to put more emphasis on protecting Afghan civilians from the insurgency, and therefore you see a change in their pattern of operations around Afghanistan to do that.
But 2010, I mean, I'll say it if Rachel doesn't, is the year in which more civilians have died than any other.
But more civilians have died because the Taliban have killed them, not because ISAF have killed them.
Well, that's because the campaign is intensifying, and you have to. I think ISAF has to bear some responsibility for that as well. They can be a magnet for the insurgency. Their presence can be a magnet for the insurgency, and the more they intensify, the more pressure the Taliban come under, and the more they are resorting to these very brutal tactics of going for the soft targets, which are civilian. We've seen, this massive increase in assassinations of civilians. We've seen the attack in Jalalabad, the attack in Kabul in the supermarket. This is a sign, I think. This is their response to the surge.
But they don't have to have that response.
No,
I repeat,
I'm not
the international
saying they don't have
forces
responsibility for this.
have an international legitimate mandate through the Security Council, and they're there to help the Afghan government. None of that applies with the Taliban. They do not have to do what they do to civilians.
No, but
There's no
I think
excuse for
that's
that, and
part
there's
and
no
I've certainly had
equivalence.
conversations with people in ISAF and special forces where they acknowledge that it is part of the it's part of the question they have when they consider these operations. What does this impact have in terms of how the Taliban and other insurgent groups respond? So they have to bear some responsibility for this. As long as this war goes on, particularly with the war being fought with this very intense kill-capture campaign by special forces, there will be a huge civilian cost. And that burden falls heavily on the Taliban, but ISAF and special forces are not immune from that.
Well, I have to say I don't agree, Rachel. The Taliban do not, there is another way forward for the Taliban if they want to live safely in Afghanistan, and it's the way President Karzai set out.
There is another issue in this, though, isn't there, which is about what they call strategic communication, which is the bigger message, and the bigger message for Afghanistan, not just for the population here in terms of understanding what the war's about. Opinion polls show that even if international forces don't cause civilian casualties, they're blamed for them. So that even if, as you say, I mean, it's very unfair, but that's how it is on the ground. Even though the Taliban are causing more civilian casualties, it's because of the nature that there's a conflict about. If those American British soldiers weren't there, people rationalise, then they wouldn't have been, this attack which killed civilians. So opinion polls are pretty clear on showing that you get blamed whether you cause the civilian casualties or not. So if you increase the tempo of the war, then both more civilians get killed, and there is this bigger problem, which is the Afghan civilian population take the view that things are going from bad to worse.
Views of the Afghan civilian population I don't think are as stark as you've said. If you look at the opinion polls, it's always difficult to rely on opinion polls, but the majority of them show that security is still the biggest concern of most of the population, and that most of the population pleased ISAF is there. It's not universal. Absolutely,
but
it's not universal.
Can I just, one very brief point on that point? You're right, David. When I was in Mirwais Hospital, the main hospital in the south in Kandahar in October, talking to victims of the conflict, every single patient I spoke to, except for one ANA soldier who said he had been shot by the Taliban, every single one said that they were killed by an American bullet, an American mine, an American bomb, which almost certainly wasn't true because the Taliban are responsible for something like 3/4 of the civilian casualties. But it is really significant that despite, I have to credit them for strenuous efforts on the part of the US and NATO to reduce civilian harm. That doesn't necessarily translate into a shift in perceptions. And actually the Afghan government bears some responsibility for this as well. When you've got people like Minister Wardak who tend to say that this is all, foreigners and Pakistanis, that conspiracy theory is also very present in some of the conflict areas as well.
There's a hand just over here, just on the side here.
Excuse me.
And then you.
Name is Kavi, and before I put the question, can I read a quote?
As long as it's a very brief one.
It is very brief. It's Frank Gardner being interviewed by John Humphreys on 3rd December 2009 in Today program. And Frank Gardner is quoting Major General Nick Carter, officer commanding NATO troops in the south. And these were the words that Frank Gardner put in his mouth. When Talibans were here, they ensured the security of highways, and they did it very effectively. You could put your daughter on the bus in Kabul, sure in the knowledge that she will get in one place in Kandahar. That's not the case at the moment. Now, having heard Karen describe the reason for our presence for the last 10 years in Kabul, in Afghanistan, can she really, with hand on her heart, say that we in this country, or Americans in United States of America, are any safer than they were before 9 September 2001? And I will gave two instances
Well, no,
of the
I think
security.
you've asked the question.
Yes.
And I think let's
One- one-
give one instance. Go on.
One instance, 9 young boys in Paktita province
Kuna.
last week
Kuna.
were
Kuna.
hunted
In Kuna.
by helicopter, and only last week the second cousin of Hamid Karzai himself was
killed.
shot in Karas village. Is that the level of security that we have provided to Afghanistan? Forget about the Taliban.
I have
they
to
got
say,
bombs.
I think security on the roads, and particularly in the south, has improved immeasurably
This
since
was 2009 that I quoted you.
since
just now.
2009.
2009.
I was
December.
since 2009. As a reporter, I can say that the security on the roads in the south has very, very significantly improved. You can drive from Gereshk to Kandahar now, for the first time really since the Taliban fell in 2001. It became grotesque after they fell, without having to pay tolls on a road that is really pretty secure. But on the sort of broader point, Karen.
Well, on the specific point first of the boys, no, that's a mistake. It's a tragic mistake. It shouldn't have happened. Petraeus has apologised. We all know apologies are inadequate at a time like this, but it's a mistake. The killing of President Karzai's relative was a mistake. However, 30 people were killed yesterday by a suicide bomb. So focusing on
Is that
numbers
a
doesn't
rightful
necessarily...
comparison?
No, what don't.
Is what?
Is that a rightful comparison? We are a legal, our forces there represent us, a civil government. Talibans or whoever they are not a government. They are
The
not
distinction
let her
I'm
ask
making
the question.
is between a mistake, however tragic, and it shouldn't have happened, and I think we all know that, and ISAF has said that. It's the difference between a mistake as part of a campaign that is sanctioned by the Security Council and supported by the Afghan government, and the deliberate targeting of civilians by the insurgents. And however sad and awful it is to have 9 boys killed, there's absolutely no comparison, no equivalence between those two things.
Here, yeah.
Hi, my name is Majda Hashmi and I'm an Afghan and trained journalist in here with a view to go to Afghanistan this year to work and live. Thank you very much for the talk. I found it really, really useful. I agree with a lot of the points that you've mentioned. I absolutely agree that Afghans are the ones that need to make the decisions, the movement to unite and to get rid of all these forces within there. But you've also said that Talibans are not united together. So what is to say that once you've had a significant amount of them agreeing with the policies that you've put in place, that the rest of them in the outskirts of the cities won't continue their ways? Shouldn't it be you concentrating on education of the people rather than enforcing them to follow more Western way of democracy? Can you not support the people in learning what their rights are? I mean, Rachel, you've made amazing points, and I think a lot of the women don't actually know that the ways the Taliban have been teaching them, the ways of Islam, is not actually the way that their religion teaches them. And if they have no knowledge of that in various areas, I mean, what is to say they can actually improve their own lives?
Emil, perhaps you could, has the international community failed in education in Afghanistan?
I'm not sure. I think some might say that they should not preach too much. So education should be left for the Afghan government. I believe sometimes the overdoing of stuff is also a problem. So in that case, probably it's.
I think personally, again, just speaking as a reporter, I was recently in Helmand and watching the way that justice and stabilisation and security are now being led by the Afghans is a completely different situation to what it was even a couple of years ago. Justice is explained as being Quranic justice. The Afghan is led by the Afghan constitution. Sharia law is being seen as a bulwark against tribal practices, as something that actually might defend women. And put forward by British justice officials. But Abdullah, the first part of this question is, if we make peace with the Taliban, what about all these other different elements of your big jigsaw puzzle? What happens to them?
So that's why, in my point of view, when you talk how to develop the culture of dialogue inside Afghanistan, needs to be just for through the Islamic language, because you are dealing with. I remember one of the experts, Western experts, wrote an article to be published about the right of women's, and she showed me the paper, and saying there is no. I heard that you are working for peace and reconciliation, and that automatically will bring Taliban to be part of the solution, and Taliban are against this and this and this and this. So we are against any reconciliation. So my point was, even when you talk about the right of women inside Afghanistan, sometimes we are talking about the same thing, but bringing it from different corners. In Afghanistan, for a tribal man or somebody living in a very far village in the mountains, if you say we are going to bring democracy, and democracy that will make your daughter goes to the school without permission or getting married without your permission, this comes with this kind of explanation. So he will resist, he will stop against it. And how the lady will be governor, how a lady will be in the parliament, how a lady that is not in our Islam, that is not. So this is, you are dealing with the tribal culture, not with Islam. Because Islam, but if you bring it, we call it in Lebanon, you want to eat the sandwich or you want to fight with the guardian. I don't know if you have this expression or not.
Doesn't quite translate. I'll have the sandwich.
You know, Alex is there, can explain it. So, what I want to say to finish the point, we want, Islamically, there is no band. It's to see the women governor or in the parliament in Islam. The lady of the wife of Prophet was a commander.
So it's about getting. It's about
so
getting
how
that
to bring it?
education.
How to bring it inside Afghanistan through Islam? Not because if you say through the West, everyone will resist. But if you say Islam say this, but let the mullah say it, the scholar say it, not.
So it's not easy to convince a mullah to say it, though.
They're working on it.
Yeah, this is a struggle.
Right at the back.
Rachel.
Owen Humphreys, an ancestral interest. How many groups have an interest in keeping the war going? Rachel mentioned the mafiosi and the warlords. You mentioned the aid war. So Sherrod Cooper Coles said something about General Richards and the reasons for the army wanting to be there for 30 or 40 years. And I'm not sure quite where that argument ended. But it is certainly true that within the British Army, talk of this is one we have to win, strategic patience, strategic stamina are still much spoken of in military circles. And despite political talks of withdrawal dates, it seems to me that there's some rowing back from that within the Pentagon and in the MOD in Whitehall. How many other groups are there?
Well, I must say, I think the deadline, David Cameron hasn't rowed back from the deadline, has he?
Nor have the Americans. What the Americans said, President Obama said, we will take some troops out in July 2011. That was misinterpreted. ISAF itself supports the transition, which is to transfer security responsibility to the Afghans. That should be completed by the end of 2014. ISAF will then transition itself to what you might think of as a supportive, mentoring, training capacity. So that's all a plan that's been laid out publicly and supported in the Kabul conference, for example.
Did you recognise the characterisation that Sherrod had in his evidence to the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee that the British Army has a vested interest in keeping it going?
No, I didn't. And I was asked this question by the House of Commons Defence Committee when I gave evidence, and I said I didn't recognise that. I think there is obviously a desire to leave Afghanistan having brought peace and security for obvious reasons. That's why we went. There is a recognition that the international community will need to be engaged in Afghanistan in one form or another for many decades. The IMF's own estimates show that Afghanistan won't be self-supporting in financial terms till around 2023. And if you think that it starts from a very low base, fourth poorest country in the world, look at how many countries around the world are still supported by various international mechanisms, whether through the UN or tailor-made mechanisms. So it would be reasonable to think that Afghanistan will need a lot of international support, but this is all about trying to put her on an upwards trajectory so that she can take on more and more of the responsibility herself.
We're moving towards the end of our time. I'm tempted, I see one or two hands. There's one here and one here. Is there one other urgent burning question? Right, these two, and then I'll ask the panellists to sort of to take those questions and sort of sum up with some concluding thoughts, particularly focused on this peace reconciliation process. First here, yeah.
Hi, my name is El-Sud Sai and I'm a filmmaker. A friend of mine recently came back from Afghanistan. She went there to make a documentary film, and her precise goal was to go over there and film a different side of Afghanistan, a different side we rarely see in the media. There's been a few documentaries that have touched upon that. One of them was Afghan Star. So she went there and she came back with a wealth of images from Kabul, from areas which you'd never see in the media, people walking freely. It's a very different kind of society. And all we are seeing on the media is this devastating side of murder and, drug addiction and all of this. The question I want to ask, succinctly as I can be, is that are we missing the point? Is Afghanistan really that bad? And are there success stories that we need to see more of to inspire confidence not just in us but in the Afghan people themselves?
An American spokesman said a few months ago, rather memorably, we won't know if the glass is half full or half empty while we're still filling it up. And the sense that the surge is still going on. But we'll come to that in a moment. And just the last question. Yeah.
Sure. My name's Arvind Hickman and I'm a journalist based in London. My question is more of an open question to all the panellists. And that is, it now seems that the West is intent on moving on from Afghanistan and thinking of exit strategies down the track. I would just like to know your thoughts about what 10 years of Western intervention in Afghanistan has actually managed to achieve for the Afghanistani people.
Abdullah, I'm going to ask you to round up. We get the wrong image, where are we 10 years on? And just to round up your thoughts on the peace process.
It's getting worse. Security speaking, getting worse. But the society, what the brother is mentioning, most parts of Afghanistan are stable. I was there, and people, especially in the north. I was in Bashir. I spent there for 5 or 6 days. So I don't know how to say it, because when you are work to mediate, you cannot say everything you have. But I'm optimistic, inshallah.
Emil, can we build on those islands of stability that we've heard about? And should I mean, I'm going to put this question to you as a journalist. I mean, does the BBC Pashto and Persian service have a uniformly negative view of what's going on, or do you?
It's not only us. I'm afraid all journalists are looking for something which is newsy. If when I was a student, I was told that if a dog bites a man, that's not a story, but if a man bites a dog, that's a story. So I'm afraid that's the way. The bad story is a story. The good story, there's none. It's not a story. In Afghanistan, in the past 10, 11 years, a lot of, in regards to school and education, a lot has happened. Millions upon millions of Afghan children are going to school, which was not possible. A lot of roads, communication-wise, a lot of mobile and internet. And I mean, sometime when I speak to young Afghans, they're more knowledgeable about science and technology and these mobiles than those Afghans who are living in London. So there's a lot of positive thing, yes, happening. But To be honest, if I tell you that there is a kid in Afghanistan who knows very good about internet or about something else, would you be willing to buy that story? I don't think so. But if I tell you that there is a suicide attack killing 36 recruit for army in Kunduz, I'm afraid every newspaper will be willing to pay me to get the story.
Rachel, I guess there is more bad news to report in Afghanistan than there is good news. But I mean, 10 years on, how does it look to you?
Clearly, many gains. You've got a vibrant media. You've got the beginnings of this, somewhat Potemkin democracy, but it's a beginning at least. You've got women active in public life. You've got lots of people going to school, including lots of girls going to school. So there are some real successes, but in the conflict areas which just grow and grow, it's bleak. It's absolutely miserable. Life is very difficult. Almost 3,000 civilians killed last year. And people under immense pressure, and as I say, this foreboding sense of rearming around the country, and I fear that with this government and with the internationals in such a rush, if we do see some kind of a peace process, it won't really deserve its name. It's more likely to be the kind of deal making that we saw in the past with some of the worst perpetrators of abuses against Afghans, because there's absolutely no sense yet that genuine red lines are going to be drawn, or that there is going to be some genuine political reform to make this a government worth making a peace with. I'll give you a tiny example. Sorry, I don't want to go on too long. You've got this reintegration process happening around the country where fighters are being encouraged to rejoin the government. And it's already being massively abused. It's very corrupt. You're seeing hundreds of people rejoining, and a lot of them are just fake. And there's absolutely no vetting of any meaningful nature going on. So I heard just last week that a mullah responsible for ordering the stoning to death of a pregnant woman last summer has just been reintegrated. And when that kind of thing is happening, and people are being brought in to have power over people's lives without any weeding out of some of the worst abusers of these communities, then this is not going to be a peace worth its name. And the same goes for the government. As long as you've got a government that is so full of corrupt mafia-like characters and former warlords, the prospects for peace and stability are bleak. But what it takes from the international community side and from the Afghan government side is serious political will to engage in the painful reforms that are required to turn around the country and to give it a real political strategy and a political future.
It's been a steep learning curve for the international community. Certainly in 2001, I think there were higher expectations. And people now, variously at different briefings you go to, they compare, they say, we're not trying to build Switzerland in the Hindu Kush. So, people are saying, well, maybe in 20 years' time we could be as rich as Bangladesh. I was at a briefing today and somebody compared it with Denmark. I'm not quite sure whether the Denmark or Switzerland are better in this sort of world view of Afghanistan, but certainly you're not now trying to sort of impose or introduce a successful, stable, functioning, amazing, democratic country. But what is good enough, Karen?
I have to say I don't like the phrase good enough. Countries aspire to a number of things, and people within those countries aspire to things, and they have every right to do so. And I think what some of the last questions and answers have brought out is that the demographics in Afghanistan are shifting. And it's not inconceivable that you have an aspirational class in the cities and a rather different social order and culture in the rural areas, and Afghanistan would not be unique in having that. And I think one of the challenges for us is not to
just
assume...
listen to the archers and you know that.
There you go. Is not to assume Afghanistan stays static. It moves, and I think I agree with Rachel that there's a lot... You have to have a sustainable political settlement, which probably means you don't rush to a political settlement within a fixed deadline. But you do, I think, start a political process that evolves, continues, draws people in, and possibly takes you past the withdrawal of the majority of Western combat troops. But I say again, this is a society that needs to get on an upwards trajectory And it will take it a while to do that, especially given its history, a generation of conflict, fourth poorest country in the world. And the international community, just as it has done with other countries, will be around to help with that. Part of the help, I think, will include the right sequencing of what it takes to bring political stability and deal with the human rights issues. You could think of it in terms of phases. Phase 1, get the security and safety settled, which means tackling the insurgency. Phase 2, if you like, you move on to tackling some of these important underlying problems to do with education, to do with governance, to do with human rights. It may not be possible to do it all at once. You may have to think of things being a bit more phasing and sequential in Afghanistan.
But that's been the mantra since the beginning, that it's security first and justice later, and I think you see the consequences of that writ large across the country. And unless you recognise that the massive injustices perpetrated by the state are also a cause of the insurgency, then it won't go away.
I think that's a valid point. I think you start everything, but you accept that some tracks will run faster.
Karen Pierce, Emil Parsley, Shaykh Abdullah Anas Bashir, and Rachel Reid, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the audience.